I really loved this article. It was something that my friend Daniel sent to me, and it's called How to Win a Debate with an Anti-Gunner, and it's by Frank Miniature. And the thing that stood out to me the most about this article was one of his key statements, and he said that he was winning debates, but he wasn't helping to change views. And so he told this story about how his wife, who worked in academia, dragged him to a fancy cocktail party, and he did not want to go. Obviously he's a big expert on the Second Amendment, on gun rights for the NRA, all of that. And so he was just kind of trying to blend in with the plants, and a history prof came over and struck up a conversation with him. And so in the conversation, he started off with a friendly, "So what do you do for a living?" And Frank was like, "Oh, I do not even want to get into this." And so, he tried to dodge the question. The prof didn't let him. So long story short, they started talking about the Second Amendment and gun rights. And it was really interesting because he said that normally he would have just whipped out all of his points and he would have just loved his debate and he would have just buried the guy with facts. But this was his wife's colleague, so he knew he couldn't do that in this situation. And so what he did instead was he started asking questions of this prof, and he started talking about history. And he started asking, the prof was saying, if we could just ban those guns, we'd be much safer and we'd be less ossified as a nation, don't you agree? And so instead of just laying out all of his points on which he was an expert on, and which he knew he could just bury this guy with, he asked, "Okay, well, if that's the case, as a history professor, what era of history would you like to bring us back to that was safer and where everybody didn't have to worry about violence, and what part of history would you like to take us back to?" And the prof, he just kind of sat there for a minute, and he's like, "Oh, well, no, I don't want to take us back in history. I want to take us to a better future." And so he thought he had tripped up Frank. And he came back and he's like, "Okay, well, can you tell me what would that look like?" And so I'm not going to go into all of it, but it was just really interesting because he started showing the prof how it was just not even a logical conclusion to think that we could create this utopian society where there would be no violence. And as a result of the approach that he took, he became friends with this man, and over the next several years, he was able to start changing this man's mind, and so now he's actually saying things like, "Hey, let's go shoot some skeet." But what's really cool about this article is that towards the end, he lays out a few different people that you might encounter on this subject. And so it's kind of like what we just did with the whole reaching out to the needy and feeding the homeless. What he does is he lays out some good approaches for how we can respond to people. So one of the examples he uses is that a school teacher who thinks that she's on the moral high ground and tells you that all guns should be banned and that gun-free zones work. Well, he just comes back with a question and he says, "Well, why do you feel that gun-free zones save lives?" And so generally they'll come back and they'll say, "Well, there's just too many guns in society." And so what really is going on is that they are concerned they don't have any experience with guns and there's a lot of fear. And so then what he does is he comes back and he talks about Evan Todd, who was one of the Columbine survivors, and he had one of the guys hold a gun to his head. And so he goes around the country and speaks about how he wishes that that day there would have been a good guy with a gun who could have walked in and stopped what was going on, and the mass murder would have been ended. So I just thought this was a fantastic article. I don't think we really have time to go into all of these issues, but let's share the link around because there's 3 or 4 really fantastic scenarios that most people are going to run into.
Well, and it's the technique that he really illustrates there. He starts out with the way he typically approaches these sort of things, that he would counterattack with shock troops of facts, and before long there would be gaping wounds in their logic and their ignorance would be bleeding all over them. And we all know people who do that, who are fabulous debaters, and they will throw facts at the liberal person and absolutely win the argument. And as Minotaur says, I was winning debates, but I wasn't helping to change views. Because what happens when you win a debate is you defeat someone and they walk off defeated, and then they hate you for it.
Right.
and this is something that we've talked about before a few times here on the Refinery.
In
Uh,
fact, today we talked about it earlier. We
well,
keep coming back to it.
yeah, but I mean, it's something that it's been a recurring theme that we've
Hmm.
reminded people that you're not Kurt Schlichter, and also that there are certain times when you need to recognize the difference between somebody who is a hardcore leftist who is never ever 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 going to agree with you, and somebody who has some leeway there, some give, somebody who you might be able to strike up a conversation with. My friend was giving a very pro Second Amendment oral argument. What happened after he gave that presentation? His professor came up to him and said, looked right at him and said, "You're lucky the First Amendment protects your freedom of speech."